On a quiet Maple Street, in a house with neatly trimmed shrubs and an American flag on the porch, Martha Dennison was preparing dinner. Her hands were chopping vegetables for the salad, and her thoughts were far away, where she would be in an hour at Sarah Howe's every Thursday for so many years that she'd lost count. The door slammed. Frank was back. His heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway, and then he appeared in the kitchen, a tall man with a military bearing and graying temples. "Going to your girlfriend's again?" Her husband's voice was full of ill-concealed irritation. Martha only smiled. In 27 years of marriage, she had grown accustomed to these comments, learned to let them pass. "I made you dinner. Heat it up when you're hungry." She wiped her hands with a towel and took off her apron. "What are you guys even doing in there all this time? Like schoolgirls, honestly." Frank opened the refrigerator and pulled out a can of beer. "Talking, watching movies, discussing books." Martha walked over to the mirror to fix her hair. "Ordinary girl stuff." Ordinary. The word sounded almost comical. There was nothing ordinary about their relationship with Sarah. There never had been. Martha looked at her reflection and saw a woman who had kept a secret for 30 years. Not a lie, but something more than the usual truth. She remembered their college dormitory, Lane Hall, room 312. 18 years old, the first year away from home, and the whole world ahead of them. And then that night that divided life into before and after. The frat party. The guy whose name she couldn't remember, the dark room upstairs, the pain, fear, and the return to the dorm room. A shower that couldn't wash away the feeling of dirt. Sarah awakened by the sound of water at 2 a.m. "What happened?" she asked then, standing barefoot on the cold floor. And Martha had told her everything, for the first time, the only time. Sarah didn't utter a word of comfort. She just sat beside her and held Martha's hand as she shook and cried. Then they lay on the narrow bed, Sarah's arms around her, shielding her from the darkness that thickened around them. After that night, Martha was afraid of touch. She flinched when boys tried to take her hand. The mere thought of proximity caused panic attacks, but it was different with Sarah. Her touch didn't scare, it healed. Slowly, day after day, night after night, talking until dawn, hugs when the nightmares came, and then the moment when comfort turned into something more. The first kiss, the first intimacy without fear. "I'll be back at 10, Martha said, putting on her coat. Frank didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the television screen, where another political commentator was ranting about traditional values. Joe's Coffee House was located in the old section of town. When Martha entered, the bell above the door jingled melodiously. She saw Sarah sitting by the window, the last rays of sunlight golden in her dark red hair, touched with gray. Their gazes met across the hall, and Martha felt a familiar warmth spilling into her chest. 30 years a lifetime, and the feeling was still the same. "You're 4 minutes late," Sarah smiled as Martha sat down across from her. "Frank." One word was enough of an explanation. Sarah nodded understandingly and gave Martha's hand a brief squeeze. No one in the coffee shop paid attention to the gesture. No one could know what was behind it, what story was behind that fleeting touch. "How was your day?" Sarah asked, but her eyes asked a very different question. "How are you really?" Martha shrugged slightly, their secret code meaning, same old, same old. "The kids had a real riot against Romeo and Juliet today. They say it's outdated." Martha had taught high school literature for over 20 years. "And you?" 3 surgeries, 1 emergency, a boy, 9 years old, appendicitis. But it turned out okay. Sarah worked as a surgeon at the city hospital. They talked about work, about the news, about the book they were both reading. To an outsider's eye, it was just a conversation between old friends, but they read each other by the slightest changes in intonation, by the movements of their eyebrows, by the pauses between words. They had been creating this language for years, as a work of art is created, with attention to every detail. When the coffee arrived, Sarah pulled a small package out of her bag. "I found this yesterday when I was sorting through old boxes." She held out a worn paperback book to Martha. "Our first gift together. A collection of Sylvia Plath's poems. They'd bought it at a sale at the campus bookstore, second semester. They read it aloud to each other, underlining lines that particularly moved them. Martha opened the book. The margins still showed their notes in different inks. Two handwritings, intertwined, complementing each other. "I can't believe it's still there." Martha ran her fingers over the faded pages. It wasn't just a book, it was an artifact of their shared past. A testament to a time when they'd been inseparable, when they'd shared one room, one life, one heart. Things were different now. Each had her own life, her own home, her own career. And yet the invisible thread that had connected them then had not been severed in 30 years. "Sometimes I wonder if we're lucky," Sarah said, looking not at Martha, but out the window, at the street where the evening lights were coming on. There was no question in her words. More like quiet reflection, Martha knew what she was thinking about. Were they lucky to have found each other? Or was it unlucky that they had found each other too soon, when they could not yet understand the depth and complexity of their feelings? That they had chosen a path that had divorced them, even if not completely? "We did what we could," Martha answered. At that time, in those circumstances, she thought back to her last year of college, how she'd gradually started dating guys, cautiously, how she'd met Frank, a friend of Sarah's brother, a serious guy just back from the army, how he had patiently courted her, not rushing her, giving her time, how Sarah had supported her, even when it meant letting go. It was their decision not to pause life, not to shut each other out, to let the relationship evolve into something that had no name. Not lovers, but closer than friends. Soulmates who found a way to stay together without destroying their lives. "Jason called today," Martha said, changing the subject. "Promised to come next weekend." Sarah smiled. She loved Martha's son as her own, had been there when he was born, had helped raise him, had always been Aunt Sarah, one of the closest people in his life. "Is he seeing someone?" Sarah asked. "I think he is, but he's not giving any details yet." They discussed Jason's job at the technology company, his plans for the future. It was always a safe topic, a shared pride in the boy they both loved. When the coffee was finished, they moved on to the little Italian restaurant across the street. It was their Thursday ritual: coffee, dinner, sometimes a movie or an exhibition. Time taken out of ordinary life to be themselves, to be together. At dinner, Sarah talked about the complicated surgery she'd had the previous week. Her hands moved in the air, showing the surgical manipulations. Martha looked at those hands, strong, sure, with long fingers, and remembered how they had touched her skin, how they had wiped away her tears, how they had held her tight in her darkest moments. No one around her could guess the story behind this dinner. To them, it was just two middle-aged women chatting over a meal. No one saw the invisible threads that bound them together through years and trials. "I found some old records," Martha said when dessert was brought to them. "Diaries from college. Was rereading them the other day." Sarah froze for a moment, then asked, "And how does it feel?" "Weird, like reading about someone else. So much emotion, so much passion, and at the same time, it's still me. It's still us." In the diaries were entries about that first year, the trauma, the fear, the gradual return to life, and about Sarah, how she had become a salvation, how she had taught them to trust, to feel, to love again, how they had crossed the boundary of friendship without noticing it. How for months they lived in a world of their own, where only the two of them existed. And then, records about doubts, about fear of the future, about the decision not to lock themselves into a relationship that society could neither understand nor accept in those years, about how they learned to love each other differently, not less, but differently. "Aren't you afraid Frank will find them?" Sarah asked. Martha shook her head. "They're in a box in the attic. He never looks in there." After dinner, they took a walk through the evening town. The air was cool and they walked close together, shoulders touching. They talked about books, about politics, about plans for the summer. Ordinary topics hiding an unusual connection. Sarah hugged Martha goodbye, tightly, as she always had. In that hug was their whole history: tenderness, protection, understanding, and a quiet sadness for what could have been, but wasn't. "See you Tuesday," Sarah said. "See you Tuesday," Martha echoed. As she walked back home, she thought about the twists and turns her life had taken. How she had gone from a traumatized girl afraid of her own shadow to a woman who had it all, a respected job, a family, and a love that lasted longer than most marriages. Frank was waiting for her in the living room, watching TV, some political show. He nodded briefly when she walked in, but didn't look away from the screen. "How's Sarah?" he asked without much interest. "Good." Martha sat down next to her on the couch. "Said hi to you." Frank hummed. He'd never understood their friendship. This woman took up too much space in his wife's life. But he accepted it the way one accepts a chronic illness, unpleasant but manageable. And then he looked at Martha, her flushed cheeks, her sparkling eyes, and the usual irritation rose in him in a wave. Why didn't she ever glow like that around him? What is there about this Sarah that he, her husband, doesn't have? "You spend too much time with her," he said, himself surprised at the sudden bitterness in his voice. Martha looked at him with mild surprise. "We see each other twice a week. It's not that much. But every time you come back, different. Different. Like, filled with something I can't give you." There was a truth in his words that Martha couldn't deny, but she couldn't explain it either. "Frank," she said softly, "Sarah is part of my life. She always has been and always will be." He turned away from the television, but his jaw tensed. "Sometimes I think the most important part." Martha didn't answer. What could she say? That sometimes she thought about this other life they could have had with Sarah? That the bond that connected them was deeper than any categories or definitions? That love is different and doesn't always fit into conventional frameworks? But she loved Frank, in her own way, differently than Sarah, but sincerely. She was grateful for his patience, for his son, for the life they had built. And yet, still her heart beat more often when she was with Sarah. Frank glanced at his watch. "It's getting late. I'm going to bed." He got up and headed for the stairs, leaving her alone in the living room with the TV running. Martha sighed. He would never understand. Would never see the invisible bond that had kept her and Sarah together all these years. To him, the world was black and white, with clear boundaries and definitions. To him, friendship existed, and love existed, and there was an unbridgeable chasm between them. He couldn't imagine that sometimes these feelings merged, creating something for which there was no name, something that could last 30 years without losing strength, something that could survive marriages, distances, life's twists and turns. Martha turned off the television and went upstairs too, feeling the familiar ambivalence, the warmth of seeing Sarah and the quiet sadness of not being able to explain to her husband what he could not, would not understand. Already in bed, listening to Frank's measured breathing, she thought of the diaries in the attic. Maybe she should have put them away better. But who would think to look for 30 years of schoolgirl writings? It was her and Sarah's secret, their story preserved in the yellowed pages, a story they'd lived, a story they'd created together, the story of a love that had no name. Frank Dennison hated disorder almost as much as he hated progressive ideas and democratic politicians. Saturday morning found him in the attic of their small Colorado Springs home, a dusty, box-strewn space he rarely looked in. But Jason was due to arrive in a week, and Martha insisted they finally sort through the junk that had accumulated over the years. 28 years of marriage coming up and we're still hoarding boxes from college, she'd said over breakfast, and Frank couldn't find an argument against it. He methodically went through the old stuff, sorting it into 3 stacks: throw away, keep, give to charity. Jason's childhood toys, long out-of-fashion clothes, Christmas decorations they hadn't used in years, boxes of books, old notebooks, and records piled in the corner. Sweat poured down Frank's face. The attic was stuffy despite the open window. He stopped to wipe his forehead, and his gaze fell on a shabby cardboard box with "University" written on the side. Curiosity took over. He rarely saw his wife's things from that period before they met. Opening the box, he found inside a stack of notebooks and notebooks, a few books, faded photographs, and a small teddy bear toy with a worn ear. Frank picked up the top notebook. On the cover in faded ink was written, "Diary, freshman year." He knew he shouldn't read it. These were his wife's personal notes, taken long before they met. But something, curiosity or instinct or fate, compelled him to open the first page. September 5th, room 312 became my new home. Mom cried when she left. I held on, but now, alone in the room, I want to cry too. I know it's stupid. I'm 18, it's time to grow up. The roommate hasn't arrived yet. I wonder what she'll be like. The usual freshman girl notes. Frank flipped through a few pages. September 7th. Sarah arrived today. Red hair, green eyes, a smile that makes you feel warmer. She's studying medicine, wants to be a surgeon, talks fast, laughs loud. I think we're going to be friends. Sarah. Frank frowned. Same name, same specialty. Couldn't be a coincidence. So this friendship had lasted even longer than he'd thought. He flipped through the pages, reading passages about the first weeks of school, about new friends, about homesickness. And then the entries changed abruptly. October 12th, I can't write. My hands are shaking. Can't tell my parents, can't tell anyone. Only write it down here so I don't go crazy. The next entry was in large, jagged letters, as if her hand was shaking. Party at Alpha Delta, drank too much. He said he'd walk me to the restroom. Can't remember his name. All I remember is that it was dark, and it hurt, and I asked him to stop. And he didn't stop. Frank froze. A chill ran down his spine. He'd never known. Martha had never told. October 13th. Can't sleep. Can't eat. Took 3 showers today. Still feel dirty. Sarah knows something's up. She found me in the shower at 2 a.m. last night. Sat on the floor next to me. Didn't ask any questions. She was just there for me. October 14th. Told Sarah. Told her everything. She held my hands and listened. Then she lay next to me and held me until I fell asleep. First time I'd been able to sleep in 2 days. Frank turned the pages, and a story unfolded before him that he didn't even realize was there. A story of trauma and slow, painful recovery, of panic attacks and nightmares, about how Martha had become afraid of any touch, any man, and about Sarah, the one person she felt safe around. November 20th. Sarah took my hand at the movies today. I didn't pull away. It's not scary with her. Her hands are different, soft, warm. She never makes any sudden movements. She always asks before she touches. Then there were notes about winter exams, about vacations at home, about returning to the university, and then an entry that took Frank's breath away. February 15th. We kissed. It happened so naturally, as if it was meant to happen. Sitting on her bed, discussing Sylvia Plath. Then she moved a strand of hair out of my face, and I don't know who reached out first. I never thought I'd kiss a girl, but with Sarah, it's different. She's my lifeline in an ocean of fear. She's the only person I feel whole with. Frank turned the page with trembling fingers. His throat went dry. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he'd always felt there was something more than friendship between Martha and Sarah. Something he couldn't understand, something he couldn't touch. March 3rd. Today we crossed the line. I never thought I could experience intimacy with someone again after what happened. But in her arms, I felt alive for the first time since that night. Her skin tastes like honey and salt. Her hands know my body better than I know myself. Frank slammed the journal shut as if he'd been burned. He needed time to digest what he'd read. He set the notebook aside, took a few deep breaths. Then he opened it again, but this time closer to the end. April 20th. Met Sarah's brother and his friend, Frank. He seems like a nice guy. Serious, but with a kind smile. For the first time in a long time, I can talk to a man without feeling afraid. That's how he came into her life. A friend of Sarah's brother. Just a nice guy with a kind smile. May 5th. Frank asked me out on a date. I told Sarah. She smiled and said I should go, that I should move on. We both know that what we have between us is beautiful but fragile, that the world isn't ready for people like us. And yet, still, when she lets me go, a part of me stays with her. Frank felt something shiver inside. All these years he'd thought he'd conquered Martha, that he'd made her forget about Sarah, about what had happened between them. Turns out Sarah had let her go. Sarah was the one who made the choice for both of them. There were still a few pages left in the diary, entries about their first dates with him, about how Martha was slowly learning to trust men again, to feel normal again, and about Sarah, always Sarah, even when she wasn't mentioned directly. She was a shadow on every page, an invisible presence in every word. The last entry was dated at the end of that school year, June 15th. Going home for the summer. Frank is leaving too. Service. He wrote me a touching letter. I think he really loves me, and I'm starting to feel something too, something real. Sarah and I talked all night about what's next, about how we'll always be a part of each other's lives, even if not the way we are now. Soulmates, she said. You and I are soulmates, and no one can take that away. Then we made love one last time, slowly, as if trying to memorize every touch. And in the morning, she drove me to the train station and kissed me goodbye, right there on the platform, full length, in front of everyone. So you won't forget, she said, as if I could forget. Frank closed the journal. There was a pounding in his temples. His hands trembled. He'd always known Martha and Sarah were close, but he hoped it was in the past, that what had been between them had ended before Martha had even become his wife. What if it wasn't over? What if all these years, all 27 years of their marriage, the bond had continued? He remembered the weekly meetings, the long phone conversations, the infrequent but regular sleepovers at Sarah's house. Female friendship, Martha had called it. He accepted that explanation because he wanted to believe it, because the alternative was too painful. Frank came down from the attic in a state of stupor. He left the diary there, unable to read anymore, but also unable to forget what he had read. Martha was at school, some extracurricular activity. He walked aimlessly around the house, trying to get his thoughts together. In the evening, Martha returned, tired but satisfied. The exhibition of my students' work went great, she said, kissing him on the cheek. How are things in the attic? Frank mumbled something in response. He couldn't look her in the eye. Not now, with the lines from her diary rolling around in his head. Her skin tastes like honey and salt. They ate dinner in heavy silence. Martha tried to make conversation a few times, but Frank answered one-wordedly, thinking about his own thoughts. After dinner, the phone rang. It's Sarah, Martha said, looking at the screen. Something in her voice, the shadow of a smile, the softness that came out of nowhere made Frank tense. He hadn't been eavesdropping on purpose. It was just Martha talking in the living room while he was putting away the dishes in the kitchen, connected to it by a wide opening. He could see her back, the way she was rubbing a strand of hair, a gesture that only appeared when she was talking to Sarah. Yeah, I miss you too, he heard her say, and then, I know, I remember every word. What was she talking about? What words? About those loving confessions she'd left in her diary 30 years ago? Of course I will, in our place. Martha said the last words quieter, almost a whisper, but Frank heard. At our place. Not in a cafe, not in a restaurant. Our place. As if they had something of their own, secret, just for the two of them. At some point, listening to this conversation, Frank realized what he'd always known. On some deep, instinctual level, he had always sensed that there was something between his wife and her best friend that he had no access to. Something that started long before him and never really ended. Martha hung up the phone and turned to him with a smile. Sarah and I are going to the theater on Tuesday. The new play, they say it's great. Frank nodded, not trusting his voice. And something inside him snapped. All these years, more than a quarter century, he'd lived with a woman whose heart belonged to someone else, whose body someone else knew before he did, and probably continued to know all these years later. That night he couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, listening to his wife's steady breathing. She slept peacefully, unaware of the storm raging inside him. He tried to remember every meeting between Martha and Sarah he had attended. He looked for signs, hints, confirmations of his new suspicions, and he found them in the way they looked at each other, in the way they finished each other's sentences, in the way they sometimes touched hands as if by accident, but delayed the touch a second longer than necessary. By morning, his suspicions had grown into certainty. It had continued. All this time it went on. On Tuesday, Martha left for the theater, dressed especially carefully, with that special gleam in her eyes that only appeared before her meetings with Sarah. Frank watched her go and felt something dark and heavy growing inside. She came back late, after 11. He was waiting for her in the living room in the dark, with a third glass of whiskey in his hand. "Frank, why are you sitting in the dark?" she asked, turning on the light. He looked at her, flushed cheeks, sparkling eyes, hair slightly disheveled. This was the way she always came back. This was the way she'd never been with him. "Did you have a good time?" he asked, not answering her question. "Yes, the play was wonderful." She took off her coat. "You would have loved it." "And after the play?" Martha frowned. "We had a glass of wine at the bar across the street from the theater. Why do you ask?" "That's it?" "Frank, what's going on?" He set the glass down and stood up. "I found your diary in the attic." She froze. Her face turned pale, almost gray. "What diary?" she asked, but he saw that she knew, that she understood at once. "From freshman year, about you and Sarah." Martha sank slowly into a chair. Her hands, usually so confident, were now trembling slightly. "That was a long time ago, Frank," she said quietly. "And now? What's between you now?" "We're friends. Close friends. Only friends." Martha looked him straight in the eye. "What do you want to hear, Frank? That Sarah and I are lovers? That I've been cheating on you all these years?" "Aren't you?" "No. What was between us then? It's in the past, in the sense you're thinking of." "In that sense?" He felt anger rising inside. "In what sense is it not left behind? In what sense continues?" Martha sighed. She didn't look guilty, more like tired, as if she'd been preparing for this conversation for years, and now it had finally come. "You've read the diary. You know what I've been through, and you know that Sarah was there for me. Was my salvation. What we have between us is not just an affair, not just a connection. It's more than friendship, more than love, more than anything you can call one word." "Do you sleep together?" Frank asked bluntly. "No," Martha answered, and he almost believed her. Almost. "Not for years, no. But you have slept together. After we were married? Slept?" She had been silent too long, and that silence was an answer in itself. "God, Martha!" He clutched his head in despair. "All these years, everything has been a lie?" "No, don't say that." She rose and walked over to him. "Everything between us is real, real. I love you, Frank, always have. But you love her more. In a different way. Not more, not less. Differently." He stepped back, not letting her touch him. "When was the last time you were with her? Not as friends, as lovers?" Martha looked away. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me. A few years ago. It happens rarely, and it's not what you think." "What do I think?" His voice became dangerously quiet. "That it's a common affair. A cheating affair. But it isn't. What's between me and Sarah is part of me. Part of who I am." Frank looked at the woman in front of him, his wife, the mother of his son, the man he'd lived with for nearly 30 years, and realized that he'd never really known her, that all this time there had been a shadow standing between them. The shadow of a red-haired woman with green eyes and a smile that made Martha's heart warm. "Were you together today too?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Martha was silent, and that silence was louder than any words. "Oh my God," Frank exhaled. "After the theater you went to her place, and you... Frank, listen." She took a step toward him. "I know it's hard to understand, but try. What's between Sarah and me is not a threat to you, not a threat to our marriage. It's just another part of my life. A part that existed before you and will always exist." Something in her words, that certainty that Sarah would always be in her life, would always hold a special place in her heart, was the final straw. It was as if something inside Frank had snapped. He didn't remember how it happened. One second, he was standing there, clenching his fists in impotent rage, and the next moment his hands were on Martha's throat. Her eyes widened with surprise and fear. She tried to push him away, but he was stronger. He was always stronger. And then something caught his hand. The heavy glass ashtray they kept on the living room table, though neither of them smoked. He didn't remember picking it up. Didn't remember dropping it on Martha's head. All he remembered was the sound, muffled, wet, and the way it settled to the floor like a marionette with its strings cut. Blood. Lots of blood. on her hands, on the floor, on his shirt, and silence, deafening silence where a second ago there had been life. Frank stood over his wife's body, and reality slowly, piece by piece, came back to him. The realization of what had happened came in an avalanche. He killed Martha, killed the woman he'd lived half his life with, because he couldn't face the truth, because he couldn't accept that her heart had never fully belonged to him. He knelt beside her, trembling hands trying to feel for a pulse. Nothing, just cooling skin and blood, so much blood. In a daze, Frank reached for his cell phone and dialed the emergency number. 9111, what's your emergency? Came the dispatcher's voice. I killed my wife, Frank said, surprised at the calmness in his voice. I killed Martha. The call came at 3 hours and 17 minutes past midnight. Sarah Baker slept lightly, as most surgeons used to emergency calls, so she woke instantly. The number was unfamiliar. It usually meant a hospital emergency. Sarah Baker, she answered, already fumbling for her slippers with her feet. Dr. Baker? This is Detective Carol Ramirez from the Colorado Springs Police Department. I apologize for the late call. Sarah froze. The police. 3 o'clock in the morning. Her first thought was a car accident. Jason or Martha. What happened? Her voice sounded calm, though her heart was already pounding somewhere in her throat. It's about Martha Dennison. Our records list you as her closest contact after her husband. Something in the detective's tone, a professional softness as if preparing for a punch, made Sarah sit up on the bed. Her knees suddenly felt woozy. What's wrong with her? She asked, and in that moment she already knew the answer. Somehow knew, even before she heard the words. I'm so sorry, Dr. Baker. Mrs. Dennison is dead. Her husband has confessed to the murder and is in custody. The world stopped. The sounds disappeared. The air became thick, not allowing oxygen into her lungs. Sarah couldn't remember what she'd said. Must have said something because the detective kept talking about how she needed to come in for a lineup, about how they would need her statement, about something else that didn't matter because Martha was gone. It was only when the call ended that Sarah allowed herself to break down. The scream that burst from her chest was the sound of tearing fabric, the fabric of her soul being torn in half. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to physically keep parts of herself from disintegrating and rocked back and forth, feeling pain of an intensity she'd never felt before. 30 years. 30 years they had been a part of each other's lives. Every meaningful moment, every sorrow, every joy, everything had been shared between the two of them. And now half of her being was simply gone, leaving a gaping wound where there had once been a connection beyond description. Frank had killed her. That thought pierced through the fog of grief, crystallizing into icy rage. Sarah rose on trembling legs. She must see him, must look into the eyes of the man who had taken Martha from her. Without remembering how she got dressed, how she left the house, how she got behind the wheel, Sarah found herself on Dennison Street. The familiar house was lit by the flashing lights of police cars, surrounded by yellow fence tape. People in uniforms and civilians scurried back and forth. They were carrying something out in evidence bags, taking pictures, doing their job. And Martha was gone. Sarah got out of the car and headed toward the house. She was stopped by a uniformed officer. Ma'am, you can't come in here. There's an investigation going on. I'm Sarah Baker. Detective Ramirez called me. The officer hesitated, but at that moment, a woman, a short Hispanic woman with dark hair gathered in a ponytail, separated from the house. Dr. Baker, I'm Detective Ramirez. Thank you for coming. Sarah barely glanced at her. Where is he? She asked, and her own voice seemed foreign to her. Hoarse, low, full of a hatred she'd never suspected in herself. Mr. Dennison is at the station, replied the detective, watching her closely. I understand how you feel, but we need your help right now. I want to see him. Sarah took a step toward the house. Detective Ramirez gently but firmly took her by the elbow. Not now, Dr. Baker. You can't go into the house. It's a crime scene. And you shouldn't see Mrs. Dennison in her present condition. Something in the detective's tone, professional compassion mixed with determination, made Sarah stop. The reality of what was happening came in a new wave. Martha is dead. Her body is out there in the house. what was left of the woman she loved more than life. Her legs gave out, and if it hadn't been for Detective Ramirez's hand, Sarah would have fallen. "Let's go," Ramirez said softly. "There's an all-night cafe not far from here. You need to have a seat, and I need to ask you some questions." They sat in the nearly empty cafe. Sarah had a cup of coffee in front of her, which she didn't touch. Detective Ramirez turned on the recorder and spoke in a soft, professional tone. "Dr. Baker, I understand this is difficult for you right now, but I need information. How long did you know Mrs. Dennison?" 30 years. Sarah looked down at her hands. "We met in college. We're roommates." "And have kept in touch ever since?" "Yes, we've been. Close." Detective Ramirez nodded, noting something in her notebook. "I understand you were her closest friend?" Sarah looked up. There was no judgment in the detective's eyes, only attention and professional interest. "We were more than friends," Sarah said quietly. "The thing that bound us together, there's no easy name for it." The detective froze for a moment, then nodded. "Can you tell me more about it?" And Sarah did. The words flowed. About the first time they met in the dormitory, about the terrible night Martha had been raped, about how they had helped each other heal, about a love that began as a comfort and grew into something for which there was no definition in the language, about how life divorced them. Martha married Frank. She was building a career as a surgeon herself, about how they never lost touch, even when circumstances changed. We loved each other, always, even when it was more than friendship, but less than a romantic relationship. She was a part of me, the best part. Detective Ramirez listened intently without interrupting. When Sarah finished, she asked, "Was Mr. Dennison aware of your special relationship with his wife?" "He knew we were close. I don't think he realized how close, or didn't want to realize." "Was he ever aggressive towards you or Mrs. Dennison?" Sarah shook her head. "No, never. He was jealous, that's a yes. Angry when Martha spent too much time with me. But physically aggressive? No, I would never have let Martha stay with him if I'd seen such signs." She fell silent, and a terrible thought raced through her brain. What if there were signs? What if she had missed something important? What if she could have prevented it and didn't? "What happened?" she asked. "I need to know." The detective paused, then said, "According to Mr. Dennison, he found his wife's old diary. Read about your relationship in college. Decided you were still, that her encounters with you were of a romantic nature." A diary. The same diary Martha had shown her the other day. The one they'd reread together, smiling at the memories of their youth. He killed her because we loved each other 30 years ago? The bitterness in Sarah's voice was palpable. "Mr. Dennison claims his wife confessed to an ongoing affair with you." Sarah closed her eyes. She imagined Martha standing in front of her husband, trying to explain what couldn't be explained, the depth and complexity of their relationship, that they were and remained soulmates even as their lives drifted apart. "He didn't understand anything," she said quietly. "He killed her because he couldn't understand." "Dr. Baker, I must ask, did you and Mrs. Dennison have a physical relationship after her marriage?" Sarah looked the detective straight in the eye. "Yes, not often. Not regularly, but there were moments." She wasn't going to lie. Not now. Not about Martha. "The last time?" "Yesterday, after the theater." The detective nodded, showing no emotion. "Thank you for your honesty." Suddenly something changed in Sarah's face. It was as if the wave of pain she had been holding back with professional willpower had finally burst the dam. "You don't understand." Her voice shook. "He didn't just kill her. He killed half of me. We were one soul in two bodies 30 years. 30 years. She was everything to me. A sister, a lover, a best friend, a other half. 30 years I woke up knowing she was somewhere, breathing, living, and now, She couldn't finish. The tears she'd been holding back all this time finally burst out. She sobbed, deep, desperate, shaking her whole body. Detective Ramirez turned off the recorder and just sat by her side, not trying to comfort her with empty words. She had witnessed many tragedies, but rarely had she seen grief of such intensity. When Sarah had calmed down a bit, the detective asked, "Is there someone I can call?" Someone who could be with you?" Sarah shook her head. "All my life in situations like this, I've called Martha." Her voice broke on the name. "I want to see him," she said suddenly. "Frank, I have to talk to him." Detective Ramirez frowned. "I don't think that's a good idea. I need to know why. I need to hear from him myself." "Dr. Baker, in your condition—" "I'm fine," Sarah interrupted. "I'm a surgeon. I know how to control my emotions." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But something in Sarah's determination made the detective agree. "Okay, but on one condition. I'll be present." The interrogation room at the police station was small and impersonal, like all such rooms. Frank Dennison sat at the table, gaunt, aged overnight. There were still traces of blood on his hands. He hadn't had time to shower. When the door opened and he saw Sarah, his face contorted. "You," the word was both an accusation and an admission of defeat. Sarah stopped in front of him, resting her hands on the table. Her fingers were a few centimeters from his. "I want to know why." Her voice was surprisingly calm. "Why?" Frank grinned bitterly. "Do you still ask? 30 years you've been between us. 30 years you owned a part of her that never belonged to me. And that's why you killed her? I didn't mean to." His voice shook. "I just couldn't bear the thought that all those years, every time she was with you." "What? What couldn't you bear, Frank?" Steel rang in Sarah's voice. "That she loved me? That she shared something with me that she couldn't give you? That our bond was deeper than you could have realized?" "She was my wife," Frank said stubbornly. "Mine, not yours." "She was a person, Frank, not a thing to be owned. She was a complex, deep woman, capable of loving more than one person, more than one way." Something flashed in Frank's eyes, a glimmer of understanding, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by familiar stubbornness. "She admitted to sleeping with you, all these years, behind my back. Not all those years. And not behind your back. She just knew you wouldn't understand, and she was right." Frank pounded his fist on the table. "You ruined my marriage." And that was the final straw. Years of control, professional calm, all her surgical stamina, all vanished in a burst of pure rage. "You killed her!" Sarah screamed, throwing herself across the table. Her hands closed around Frank's neck before Detective Ramirez could react. The guard rushed into the room. The two of them dragged Sarah away, who continued to scream. "You took her from me. You took her from all of us. From Jason, from her students, from everyone who loved her." Detective Ramirez held her firmly by the shoulders. "Dr. Baker, calm down. This isn't going to help. It won't help anyone." As if awakening from a trance, Sarah went limp in the detective's arms. Frank sat holding her neck, his eyes wide with shock. "See?" he said to the guard. "She's crazy. She attacked me. Martha was the same way, under the influence of that woman." Sarah burst out again, but Detective Ramirez held tight. "Take Mr. Dennison away," she ordered the guard. When they were alone, the detective sat Sarah down in a chair. "I understand your feelings. I really do. But you're only going to hurt yourself this way." "I can't be hurt anymore," Sarah replied quietly. "The worst has already happened." A week later, Jason arrived in Colorado Springs. In that time, Sarah managed to pull herself together. Years of surgical practice had taught her how to work through a personal catastrophe. The grief hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply settled into a framework that didn't interfere with functioning. Jason looked drained and lost, but he held himself with the stoic calm that Sarah had always seen in Martha. They met in a small park, a neutral area Sarah had chosen. Neither the funeral home nor the house where his mother had grown up, and where she was now gone, were appropriate for this conversation. "Jason," Sarah said, making no attempt to hug him, giving him space. "Aunt Sarah," he stammered, unsure how to address the woman he'd known all his life and who turned out to be more than just a family friend now. "Just Sarah," she said softly. "Let's take a walk." They walked along the parkway, a healthy 30-year-old man and a middle-aged woman with a perfectly straight back and eyes in which pain froze. "The detective told me a lot of things," Jason began. "About you and Mom." Sarah nodded. "I'm guessing. Any questions?" 1,000. He was silent for a moment. "Did you love each other? All this time?" Yes, but not in the way you think right now. What we had in college, it shaped us both. But then life took its course. Your mother met Frank, fell in love with him, started a family. We became something different to each other. Not more or less, just different. But you were still close. In a way? Sometimes, Sarah said honestly. Rarely. At special moments when circumstances brought us back together. For us, it was part of our connection, but it didn't define it. Jason paused, staring at some point in space. My whole life, my family's entire history, it wasn't what I thought it would be. Sarah shook her head. No, Jason, you don't understand. Your mother really loved your father, really was happy with her family, with you. What we had with her, that was another aspect of her life that canceled nothing out. But your father couldn't understand that. For him, there was only either or. Either she loved him or she loved me. He couldn't imagine that the heart could hold more than one love, one affection. And that's why he killed her. Jason's voice carried the same steely note that Sarah had heard in her own conversation with Frank. He killed her because he was faced with a truth he couldn't accept, Sarah said simply. And now we all have to move on somehow. Jason looked at her, the woman who had been there for every major event in his life, every illness, every accomplishment. What happens now? He asked. The funeral, a trial, then life, Sarah spoke calmly, almost detachedly. I have surgeries scheduled months in advance, patients who need me. You have your job, your life in California. We'll get by. We don't have a choice. There was no patheticness or guff in her voice, just the quiet confidence of someone who had seen death too often to let it ruin a life. Jason nodded. Yes, but nothing will ever be the same again. It never is, Sarah said softly, and for a moment a spark of understanding ran between them. They were both Martha's children, each in their own way. The diary was found during a search of the house. Detective Ramirez had brought it to Sarah, evidence the investigation no longer needed. I thought you might want to keep it, she said. I don't know if it's legal, but I think you should have it. Sarah held the shabby notebook in her hands, a testament to the time when she and Martha had been young, when everything had just begun. She knew every page by heart. They'd reread the entries many times over 30 years, laughing at the naivety of youth, remembering what had been. Thank you, she said, gently accepting the journal. There's something else. The detective pulled out an evidence bag. The last entry, it wasn't in this diary. It was found on the nightstand by the bed, apparently written recently. Sarah unfolded the sheet. There it was written, in the same handwriting, but more mature, more confident. February 23rd. Talked to Frank yesterday. Same story again. He doesn't understand why Sarah is so important to me. I'm tired of explaining things he doesn't want to hear. Sometimes I think he's becoming a different person. Tougher, angrier. Maybe it's time to make a decision. Maybe I've been trying to sit on two chairs for too long. I'll talk to Sarah after the show. It's time for a change. Sarah looked up at the detective, her throat constricted. She sensed danger, Ramirez said quietly, probably on a subconscious level, and was about to make some kind of decision. She wanted to leave him. Sarah stared at the familiar handwriting, the words written by the hand she knew so well. All these years she tried to fit both of us into her life, and in the end she decided to choose. And for that he killed her, the detective finished grimly. The trial was swift and ruthless. Frank had pleaded guilty, which made it easy. Sarah testified, calmly, composed, articulate. She talked about her and Martha's relationship, without concealment or embellishment. She saw the jury exchanging glances, some with judgment, others with understanding. She wasn't looking for sympathy, didn't need it. She just wanted the truth to be heard, to remember Martha for who she was, complex, loving, whole. Frank Dennison looked up at her from behind the defense table. There was no more hatred in his eyes, just the blunt, meaningless emptiness of realizing what he'd done. 20 years, the judge announced, without parole for the first 10 years. He banged the gavel, and it was over. After the trial, Detective Ramirez approached Sarah. What are you going to do now? Same thing I've always done, Sarah replied as she packed her bag. I'm going to save lives. Martha did it in her own way, through literature, through education. I'm doing it with a scalpel. I'll keep at it. They walked out of the courthouse on a spring day, bright, fresh, full of the promise of life. Ramirez looked at the woman beside her, strong, broken, and unbroken at the same time. "You know," the detective said, "all these weeks I've been trying to figure out what you had with Martha, and I'm still not sure I fully realize it." Sarah smiled weakly, for the first time in a long time. No one understood, except ourselves, and it cost her her life. "No," Sarah shook her head. "Her life was cost by one man's limitations, his inability to accept what didn't fit into his picture of the world. Our love, no matter how extraordinary it was, didn't kill anyone. It gave life." They said their goodbyes outside Sarah's car. The detective held out her hand. "If you need anything." Sarah nodded, shaking her hand. "I can handle it." That evening she opened Martha's journal. She hadn't intended to, but her hands reached for the familiar notebook on their own. There was something between the pages. A faded photograph and a tiny, flat, dried edelweiss fell out into the palm of her hand. Sarah froze. The air caught in her lungs. That flower. She remembered it. 30 years ago, at the summit, she'd plucked it and held it out to Martha, a silly, sentimental gesture. "Edelweiss, a symbol of eternal love or something," she'd said then, smiling embarrassedly, not giving it much thought. "Just a pretty flower found on the trail. A trifle." Martha had kept it, all these years, hidden between the pages of her most intimate, most personal record, and never spoke of it. Something snapped inside Sarah, where she thought there was nothing else to break. A lump rose in her throat that neither tears nor screaming could dissolve. She stared at the tiny flower, so fragile she was afraid to breathe. Martha had kept it, all this time. Sarah closed the journal, put it on the edge of the table, poured herself a whiskey and turned on the TV, some old movie. She sat down on the couch and took a sip. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a slight movement. The couch seemed to sag beside her as if someone had sat down. It felt familiar, like those evenings when she and Martha watched movies with their shoulders touching. "Hi, Martha," Sarah said quietly, not taking her eyes off the screen. There was no response. Of course there wasn't. Sarah knew that. But a habit of 30 years couldn't disappear overnight. Like old knees remembering the pain of a long-ago injury. Like hands remembering touch. How the body instinctively turns to the empty space next to it. She has surgery tomorrow at 7. Need to get at least a few hours of sleep. But she continued to sit, staring at the TV and not seeing him, confident that she wasn't alone.